Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
From the New York Times opinion section, partisans are girding for civil war. Robots are coming for our jobs, and the news feels like a multi-car pileup every time you fire up Twitter. Our pessimists see crises everywhere. Our optimists insist that we're just anxious because the world is changing faster than our primitive ape brains can process. But what if the feeling of acceleration is an illusion, conjured by our expectations of perpetual progress and exaggerated by distorting filter of the internet? That's what we're looking at today. And everybody's like, oh my gosh, what? The age of decadence. And this is actually an excerpt. It was in the New York Times opinion section, but it's adapted actually from a book, that recently came out. And so we're going to look at today this idea of decadence. And if you don't know what that is, we're going to go over it in just a second. But the question is this progress, and I'm using air quotes here, really all just an illusion? Or is it as great as it's made out to be? But of course, we couldn't begin a conversation on politics, progress, and society without
TrueChat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
You have to love the word decadence. It's usually used to describe, something. But in this case, we're going to use it as a noun, and not to get into all the English grammar there. But this is very interesting because are we really seeing things? Are things really changing and being done differently? And as the older person in this duo, I am constantly bringing up to my co-host that, we did this, or we had this, or this was that. And it's like, the eyes get big, like, oh, well, really didn't know that. So, back to you, sir. And what are we going to use as a definition for our discussion today for the word decadence?
So the article lays out decadence as a term that refers to economic stagnation, institutional decay, and cultural and intellectual exhaustion at a high level of material prosperity and technological development. Now, if that just was like your mind just kind of blew up there a little bit, or if it just malfunctioned, the gist of it here, okay, what the authors claim is we're cut off from the past, no longer optimistic about the future, and growing old in the light of tiny screens. And the old is referring to not our physical age, but our societal age, our interest in, because youth is typically associated with change and energy, right, Lance? And,
right.
And this optimistic outlook. So old in this case is not necessarily referring to, again, physical age. It's referring to some of the things we tend to associate with old age, which is complacency, or a lack of drive.
Have we really come up with anything earth shattering in the last 30 to 50 years? Well, is basically what the article is about, is what I took from it.
Exactly. Well, and I think also the idea, right, that as we spend time in front of our screens, we are becoming more content with just kind of the way things are.
Well, and the economy, and I know, now today it seems bad, it's taken a turn for the worse, but overall people have a higher standard of living than they've had ever in the history of the world. I mean, things are there, at our fingertips that we have. And so it's kind of like, wow, it's really changing because I can hit a few buttons on this device and send a message around the world. So, wow, isn't it really changing? And is that really change? Is that, and is having all of this technology really life changing, or does it just make us feel like it's life changing?
Well, and I think that's a big part of the examination that the author gets into. But one thing he mentions from a historical standpoint that I think is important, because when we talk about, well, why do you care? Does it really matter if we've become a decadent society? Does that maybe mean that we've, reached the pinnacle of what
we've accomplished everything that mankind can do?
Right. Well, and so for some perspective, the Chinese and Ottoman empires persisted for centuries under decadent conditions, and it was more than 400 years from Caligula to the actual fall of Rome. And one of the things that they go on to explain, what fascinates and terrifies us about the Roman Empire is not that it finally went smash, but rather that it managed to last for 4 centuries without creativity, warmth, or hope. And I think that is, Lance, I've told you.
Just stayed on an even keel and just kept going.
Right.
No big changes one way or the other.
You kind of reach your pinnacle and then you plateau. And then after the plateau, you don't start going back up again. In most cases, you start downhill. And that's exactly what happened to these empires that we were just talking about. And I think that is a point of interest for a lot of historians when they're looking at, for example, the Roman Empire. It's one of the things that I was actually just remarking to Lance the other day when we were preparing this episode is it's really interesting. The book that I'm reading on Rome, ends, at the end of the book is actually like 200 or 300 years before Rome,
the fall of
faded
Rome.
into dust.
Right.
Because
nothing different happened the last 200 years, right?
Yeah.
We can stop the book here because everything else just kind of was running on automated control, right? It was just like, here we go, automation, just day after day after day, same stuff until eventually somebody else came up with a better idea, a better way to do things and supplanted the Roman Empire because somebody else was working to actually change things or come up with a new idea or to get better at something.
Right. And one of the things that goes on to talk about, because what we're going to do, since we've kind of laid out understanding what we're talking about in the second segment of today's show, in the third segment, we'll look at things like the economic impact, how we've become a more peaceable society, the ultimate problem that we're facing as a result of this, and the politics of it all. So there's a lot of that to come. But one of the things we want to talk about is, and Lance kind of already mentioned this, Silicon Valley, because that's often pointed to, right, as look at what's happening and look at what's being made. And one of the great things about this article, and the reason that I'd recommend that you go read it, is it gives a really nice example with Uber and how you kind of have this idea that's really more about creating convenience than it is about doing something that's revolutionary. The only reason it's revolutionary is because somebody hadn't already done it on this scale. And that, I think, is a perfect example of what the rest of it speaks to. A lot of these things that are held up, right, Lance, as, look how amazing this is, and we've never done anything like this. Most of it is a convenience item,
right?
Not so much. And now, and just to be clear, because you could make the argument, right, that going from having to walk or ride a horse to a car is a convenience item. And it is. I mean, you're not wrong to say that that is definitely an increase in convenience, but it changed the landscape of what was possible in regards to where you live and where you could realistically go as an everyday person. Because obviously the wealthy traveled, but it also made travel immensely easier. I remember when we were reading some of these history books, Lance, a big thing they talk about is just how long it took to get from place to place.
Well, and people used to be born and live and die within 10 miles of their birthplace. They spent their entire life within 10 to 15 miles of where they were born.
Right.
And the car, the train, the plane, the car, all of that transformed that to where now we can get almost anywhere we want. Whereas Uber, well, we already had taxi cabs. We already had buses. It's just made it, like you said, more convenient. And the other part of that, of the Uber story, as it points out in the article, all these millions of dollars have been invested in Uber and in this wonderful new life-changing, to hear them talk, company for what? And the what is it's losing money every economic quarter. So if this is such a great change, why is it not? It has all these investors and all this money pouring into it. How come it's not profitable for the company? And again, I will say, as you have, maybe you haven't shared this in a long time, but you're very, I'll let you defend yourself here, anti-Apple, because it's like, what's new that they've come up with? You know, what's really different between an iPhone 2 and an iPhone 10? Or I don't even know if I'm using the right numbers, but it's like, we come out with all these new things and it's like, really, is it? I mean, it's new because now you've changed one or two things, but does it really do anything any differently? Has it really going to change the way we live? And that's what we're talking about when we say, you know, stalemate and stagnation with ideas.
Right. And I'll say this. I mean, I'm not an economist, and I'm sure that people could, you know, explain to me better why Apple deserves to be the world's most valuable company. But I'm sure you could probably find economists out there who would definitely argue that it shouldn't be. And I think part of what Lance is talking about there is when Apple released the iPhone, that was revolutionary in many ways. I mean, this idea that you could now carry essentially, a real computer in your pocket that would give you access to the wealth of knowledge of humanity, that is a pretty, substantial thing.
Right.
But now we're 10 years later, a little more than that, I guess. And really what Apple has done is nothing that totally pales in comparison. Our next thing is we release the iPad, which is basically just a big version of the phone.
Right.
Really,
we're going to look at a bigger screen. We're going to look at a bigger screen.
And that it's not on the same level, and then we release a watch that can do basically a little less than what the phone could do, but you can wear it on your wrist,
but it's not the difference between getting on a horse or jumping into an airplane.
Right. And
that's a huge, that's a difference that just changes everything in society.
And it's not the difference between taking the power of all the computers that took us to the moon, multiplying it by 10 and then shrinking it to something that you can put in your pocket. It's not on that level. It's not to say that the iPad or the Apple Watch or things like that, it's not to say they didn't have an impact or that they weren't interesting from a technological standpoint, but it's to say that relative to some of the things that were done, it's not as impressive. And that is why, I have problems with what Microsoft does, but part of the reason that I've been more interested in recent years in them, Lance, is because their new CEO kind of owned up to and said, we have a problem. We have become decadent. And we have to do something about that, because if we don't, we will fade from the limelight. And granted, they had a longer history, but then they started to think about, well, how do we, reinvent categories? And that's the mindset. And what is concerning to me about Apple, and this is a larger concern, is we're not really interested in reinventing categories. We're more interested in, we'll just improve the categories.
Well, so that we can take in more money, which is stalemate and stagnation and decadence. It's not about really changing people's lives. We sell it as it's changing your life, but it really doesn't, or at least not on the same level as real revolution.
And here's a little tidbit on what's coming up. American entrepreneurship has been declining, Lance, since the 1970s. During Jimmy Carter's presidency, 17% of all United States businesses had been founded in the previous year. Think about that. 17%, almost 1 in 5 businesses had been founded just the year before. But by the start of Barack Obama's second term, that rate was about 10%.
Yep.
And in the late 1980s, almost half of United States companies were young, meaning less than 5 years old. So what happened? Why did that stop? And what does that mean for our future? Those are the questions we'll be answering coming up. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
The Age of Decadence. It's an opinion piece from the New York Times. If you want to follow along, you can do so at thestateofus.org. We've got the article linked there. American entrepreneurship has been declining since the 1970s. Early in the Jimmy Carter presidency, 17% of all United States businesses had been founded in the previous year. By contrast, at the start of Barack Obama's second term, that rate was about 10%. And in the late 1980s, almost half of United States companies were young, meaning less than 5 years old.
Exactly. I mean, that's the whole point of when I said, excuse me there. That's the whole point when I said nothing's really changed since the, 1970 to 1990. And you've just given those stats that proves what I said earlier, in that that's the last time we had any real revolutionary businesses. I mean, that's when things were really hopping and going. And since then, we've kind of just settled down and said, yeah, this is kind of nice.
We used to travel faster, build bigger, live longer. Now we communicate faster, chatter more, snap more selfies. We used to go to the moon. Now we make movies about space, amazing movies with completely convincing special effects that make it seem as if we've left Earth behind. And we hype the revolutionary character of our communication devices in order to convince ourselves that our earlier expectations were just fantasies, Jetsons stuff. And this progress is the only progress we could reasonably expect. And you'd be forgiven for thinking that Lance wrote that.
Right. I mean, because I don't know if you guys are familiar, but watch the cartoon, The Jetsons. That's what I grew up on, and I'm still waiting for my tower unit to live in the sky, that's not supported by all these other things, but it's just suspended in the sky where I can live, and I fly my car right into the air garage where I park it.
So some stats that help explain this. America is a more peaceable country, Lance, than it was in the 1970s or 1990, with lower crime rates and safer streets and better behaved kids. But it's also a country where that supposedly most American of qualities, wanderlust, has markedly declined. Americans no longer go west or east or north or south, for that matter, in search of opportunity the way they did 50 years ago. In fact, the rate at which people move between states has fallen from 3.5% in the early 1970s to 1.4% in 2010. So over a 50% decline, Lance.
That's one of the most interesting things that I found in the article, is that you want to talk about stagnation? We as a people have stagnated. We're staying in the same place. We're not, and it talks too about looking for jobs and changing jobs, and people aren't doing that either like they used to. I'm not saying that we're not saying people aren't moving and people aren't changing jobs. Yes, they are, but they're not doing it at the rate that they used to. And as far as the culture, oh man, yeah. Oh, well, look at Twitter. Look at all the people ranting and raving on Twitter. Okay. People used to get off their bottoms and go downtown and go to the Capitol and go places and have marches and rallies and show their spirit in the street, so to speak, and actually do things. Now you just sit on a phone and post it. I don't think that's the same. You're not as actively involved. And now we can open this up for discussion. Are you as passionate? If you're willing to get out of your comfortable home and go walk down the street and make a sign and join others in your community for change, for whatever the change is that you want to see, isn't that a bigger deal than just sitting on your phone or sitting on your phone and scrolling down and hitting like, don't like, whatever the emojis are or whatever that you have on those phones that you people carry. I say that in all, transparency, because I don't carry one. Which one is actually doing something?
Well, and here's kind of the interesting thing, because there's this section, we listen to, and we've talked some about some of these conspiracy theorists and online, this is the way the world has taken over control of us type of things. But when you read this next bit, Lance, some of this starts to come into a little bit of focus and makes you think maybe there's a little bit of truth to some of this that's being said. Listen to this. Meanwhile, those well-behaved young people that we were just talking about are more depressed than prior cohorts. They're less likely to drive drunk or get pregnant, but more tempted towards self-harm. They are also the most medicated generation in history, from the drugs prescribed for ADHD to the antidepressants offered to anxious teens, and most of the medications are designed to do what? They're designed to be calming, offering a smoothed out experience rather than a spiky high. For adults, the increasingly legal drug of choice is marijuana, whose prototypical user is a relaxed and harmless figure, comfortably numb, experiencing stagnation as a chill good time.
What do you want me to say? I'm just sitting here nodding my head like, yeah, that's it. I mean, people look at me weird because this old guy I get fired up. I get passionate about stuff and everybody's like, dude, take a drug, calm down. I'm like, why? Don't you have passion towards what's wrong with our society or things we need to change? Or it's like, man, everything's cool. Just relax. Why are you so uptight about stuff? I get that all the time. And maybe it's because I am a child of, the late 60s and early 70s when things were changing and we were standing up and we really were trying to make a difference. And now if somebody does that, it's like you said, we medicate children. I mean, at a time when they're supposed to be intellectually stimulated and experiencing and taking all of these things in, we say, yeah, you got to calm down. You're a behavior issue. Okay. And it's like, and we know, and I can bring it up, your Edisons and people like that didn't partake in the school system because they didn't get along. They didn't function well. I remember the greatest thing and the worst thing that ever happened to me is when they handed me the book, in 10th grade and said that I had rights. I'm like, yeah, I'm 15 years old and I got rights. I have a right. I have this. I can do that. And that's the way we live. That was our society. And we honored people for that. And I remember the older people saying, oh, this is going to be the downfall of our society. But that, as pointed out in the article, that's the last time things really changed.
So, here's what it boils down to is the creation of a feedback loop. And this is, I think, Lance, tell me if you disagree, but from what I know about some of the empires we talked about before, the Ottoman Empire, the Roman Empire, this is kind of what happens, this feedback loop in which our sterile nature feeds stagnation, which further discourages childbearing, which sinks society ever deeper into old age, makes demographic decline a clear example of how decadence overtakes a civilization. Now, important here, the author goes on to say, which is, to be clear, hardly the worst fate imaginable. Complaining about decadence is a luxury good, a feature of societies where the mail is delivered, the crime rate is relatively low, and there's plenty of entertainment at our fingertips. Human beings can still live vigorously amid a general stagnation, be fruitful amid sterility, be creative amid repetition. And the decadent society, unlike the full dystopia, allows those signs of contradictions to exist, which means that it's always possible to imagine and work toward renewal and renaissance. And here's what I want to say real quick about this, Lance, because people listening and they're like, man, you guys are just really harping on how much we suck, At the same time, in contrast to all of this, while much of society has become complacent, right, or has generally accepted the idea of, leveling out emotionally, leveling out societally, becoming, content. And it isn't to say, again, that's a very first world problem. To be clear, this can sound very whiny that it's like, really, we're complaining about being content and there's people around the world that are starving or fighting civil wars or walking across the desert.
Yes, but why aren't we solving those problems? Because we're content. And
exactly.
I don't mean to interrupt you because it's probably exactly where you were going. But why aren't we solving those problems then? Because we're content in our own lives.
Well, and we just discussed too, right, that we are near the cusp of perhaps humanity's greatest achievement. It was just a couple weeks ago when we talked about the real possibility of immortality around the corner. But Lance, those people right, aren't living this way.
Right.
They aren't satisfied. They want more. They believe it's possible. And those are the things that are truly making the possibility of our greatest achievement, immortality, a realistic thing to see perhaps in our lifetime. So that is all in contrast and something to think about here as we head into how does this speak to our politics? Because all of this, it can explain things like Trump and Bernie Sanders. If you're wondering how, you'll have to keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Now you may probably have an obvious objection to the portrait of stagnation. What about politics? Wouldn't a decadent society really produce the 1969 days of raids on social media with online mobs swarming and the old extremes back in action? Would it produce populist surge and a social revival, a domestic civil war so polarizing that Americans could mistake the work of Russian hackers for the sincere convictions of their fellow citizens? Would it elect Donald Trump as president? Would a decadent society, Lance, really do all of that?
Yes.
And strangely, Lance might be right. Both populism and socialism, Trump and Bernie Sanders, represent expressions of discontent with decadence, rebellions against the technological management of stagnation that defined the Obama era. Make America Great Again is the slogan of a reactionary futurism, a howl against a future that wasn't what was promised, and the Sanders Revolution promises what the left lost somewhere in the Reagan era can be regained, and the climb to utopia begun anew. In other words, the reason these exist, Lance, is because people have this feeling, right? They don't know what it is, and it's deep down somewhere that says we've lost something. I don't know what it is that we've lost.
And we're searching for it.
And
so you come up with an idea or you have a saying or a slogan and it's like, yeah, maybe that's it. I'll try that because I can't pinpoint. I can't put my finger on it, but what you say makes sense. And so I'm going to try that out and see if that works. See if that makes me feel more fulfilled. And so I totally get that. The only thing I want to say too is we're talking about how you get stagnation and grow old. We only how do we stay young? I pose that question. And for me, it's being around young people. But if we're not, as you pointed out in the last segment, if the birth rate is going down, then we're not producing the young people that will hopefully pull us out of the stagnation, who won't be satisfied, who will look at things with open eyes and try to come up with some solutions instead of those of us who are a little older regurgitating the old ideas that we have come to believe in and do. That's what causes stagnation.
Well, and here's the thing, Lance, because
being stagnant and decadent, right?
We try to make sure that we're giving attention to the counter argument. And I do think there's a counter case here for decadence, right? Is that decadence.
Yeah, life is good.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got no complaints. Life is good, but what am I solving? How am I helping my fellow man? How am I making the world better? Well, I'm not, because I'm just sitting there thinking, my life's pretty good.
Right. But there's also the case to be made for growth's sake isn't good either, because it leaves a lot of people behind. And that's a big part of what we've seen is, statistically today, less people get left behind than they did 60, 80 years ago. People dying of things they no longer die of today. And the least among us having more than the least among us used to have. It may have been hard for us, but it wasn't hard the way it is for some people around the world. So it's easy to feel like, relative to what we once knew, we really aren't doing all that much that's great. But at the same time, we have to remember that this balancing out, this leveling off of less crime, of a more mellow society, also means that it's a safer society. We have to be careful about society will not continue to get better if we don't recognize that we can't stay a mellow society forever.
Okay. I mean, I agree with that, but that's the whole point is that, as you just said, your last phrase, we can't stay this way. And I understand recognizing the other side, but by the same token, we're not going to solve some of the problems we still have if we all just remain seated and saying, well, our life's okay, and not get up and do anything about it.
I wonder how much of this too, because remember, this is an opinion piece, folks, that we're quoting from here. That the Times is not attempting to present this as this is the only interpretation of how things are, because it is a matter of perspective, a matter of opinion. Some of the stats you maybe can't negotiate, but how you interpret them is relative too. And I think one other side to look at here, Lance, is, do most people though truly understand some of the progress that's being made that's behind the scenes? Do they really get just how revolutionary that is? Because things like working on, I don't know about you, but when we read that book, Immortality Inc., and we had our National Geographic explorer on who wrote it, there was kind of that, that stirring inside of, oh my gosh, there's some people out there doing that is amazing. That's more amazing than anything that I can think of, really. When you talk about, changing, forget living forever, but even when you talk about doubling or tripling the human lifespan to, 200, 300, 400 years, that is by far and away, takes the cake for sure of all these different things that we've accomplished in our history. And then you also have to look at things like the danger, though, of our own accomplishments, especially now, because we're kind of at this tipping point of, what are we going to be able to accomplish? AI is another one, Lance. We talk about that a lot. We talk about why people should worry about it. Here's another reason people should worry, because it could truly be revolutionary, but revolutionary isn't always a good thing, right? If the AI that a lot of people talk about comes to fruition, this idea that there's no problem too great for our artificial intelligence to solve, that only serves to make us more of a decadent society, because now we don't have to work to do anything, right? We built the machines that can solve all the problems for us. So why try? Why strive for anything when you've got something that can figure basically any problem out? You don't have to strive in that case because somebody else is doing the work for you. So I think it's and this is what I said in the immortality episode, these things, same thing with immortality. If we're living for 800 years, that drive to make the most out of your life, I think diminishes a little bit, because it's like, I got a lot more time.
So we stop because we're scared of the future?
No.
And just sit back and say, no, we'll just keep the status quo because anything that we do could upset the apple cart.
No, I don't think so at all. I think that the opposite is the case. We have to push forward, but we have to push forward as a society that wants to know what's happening, because I think a lot of people turn away from these things because they feel like they're too complicated to understand, or they don't like the questions they bring up. So rather than talk about it at all, people don't talk about it any. They avoid the conversation. And I think if we're going to push forward into these futures to avoid the ultimate decadent society, the one of, to move to a completely sedentary lifestyle where the machines take care of everything for us. It doesn't mean that that's where we'll go if these things happen, but it does mean that's where we'll go if we're all too afraid to engage in the conversation of, what do we want from these things? Because we've mastered an incredible amount of things in human history, but a lot of that mastering has happened in the last 200 or 300 years relative to our entire existence. And I thought that was one of the things in immortality that was interesting.
Good question. But I would.
There you go, Lance. Just answer that.
Did you want me to answer? Well, I will answer it this way.
30-second answer.
I will answer it this way, in that and this is for another show, is, well, the reason they're not is because they're working their butts off to try to provide for themselves and their families. And so I can't worry about these big issue questions that you just raised because I'm working 60 hours a week to try to put a roof over my kid's head and put food on my table, or I'm doing that for myself because my job doesn't pay enough. And you want me to worry about AI and the ability to live forever? I'm trying to stay alive right now. And so there's the counter, to what you're saying. You're talking in this very grandiose idea, and I agree with you, and I like the statement. But for most people out there, the struggle to stay alive on a day-to-day basis takes away any opportunity they have to pay attention to these bigger issues. And so they just settle in and they strive for decadence. They strive for the ability to just be able to sit back and relax and reap the benefits of their labor versus throwing things and making it even more chaotic for the hope that it'll get better in the future. That's my answer to you.
We'll let everybody contemplate this. Isn't what Lance just said doesn't it embody the very epitome of what we've discussed today? Not Lance's claim, but I think his statement about society is correct. It's the idea of either or. We have to be the type of people that believe we can have our cake and eat it too. And that is the problem with the statement that Lance made. Not the problem with his statement. The problem with what he described is this idea that the only thing that I can achieve is to be comfortable. To me.
That's the issue. No, that you said problem, but I would have substituted the word issue.
Yeah.
That's the issue that we're dealing with.
Right. That we're talking about
as a people.
And speaking of what we're talking about today, Lance, because we want other people to get involved in this and we want them to tell us their thoughts. That all speaks kind of to our greater mission here at True Chat, right? The reason that we're taking time to have a conversation about decadence in the first place is because of that mission, which is?
Well, we've spent this 35 or 40 minutes discussing this because we are trying to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations.
And if we're going to grow this respectful conversation and get more honest and open about things, it requires other people getting involved. You have to, have a big tent, right?
You have to tell others.
You have to tell others. And Lance, if I'm sitting at home listening or I'm in my car and I think, I know somebody that might like this. This is it's a syndicated radio program, but it's also a podcast that's released on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So if somebody wanted to tune into the podcast or invite somebody else to tune into the podcast, what are some of the ways they could say people could listen?
Well, anywhere that you're listening to a podcast, so you can be Stitcher, Spotify, Apple Podcast, or however else you can get us, or, you can always go to the website. But obviously if you're driving a car,
don't do that.
Don't do that. But, please let people know how to get a hold of us. And if you're not sure, ask your children because they will know how to get to the podcast.
For the State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.